"You don't belong here. This gate isn't for your kind." The words hung in the air like poison, delivered with a cold authority that made the small crowd of waiting vehicles fall silent. Officer James Hawkins stood with his hand resting on his holster, his face twisted into a sneer as he stared down at the aging black man sitting behind the wheel of a modest sedan. The man's military ID was already extended through the driver's side window, official, legitimate, valid, but Officer Hawkins refused to even glance at it. Instead, he looked pointedly at the walking cane resting against the passenger seat, then back at the driver with undisguised contempt. "Sir, I've been coming through this gate for 15 years, the driver said, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "I'm a retired master sergeant. My ID is valid. There's no reason for this." Officer Hawkins leaned closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I decide who goes through my gate, and today you're not getting on my base." What Officer Hawkins didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined as he flexed his temporary power at the military base checkpoint, was that the man he was deliberately humiliating wasn't just any retired veteran. Master Sergeant Marcus Washington was the newly appointed base Provost Marshal, essentially the chief of police for the entire installation. He was on his way to his first day in his new position, where he would be Officer Hawkins' commanding officer. And in exactly 12 minutes, Officer Hawkins would face the consequences of his actions in front of the very personnel he'd spent years intimidating. Before we dive deeper, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe in accountability and respect for our veterans, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Let's get into this incredible story of justice served. The morning sun cast long shadows across the entrance to Fort Bennett Military Base. Cars lined up in neat rows at the checkpoint, military personnel and civilian contractors presenting their IDs with practiced efficiency as they headed to work. Marcus Washington sat patiently in his 10-year-old Toyota Camry, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks rather than a uniform. At 58, his closely cropped hair had gone salt and pepper, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of decades of service. 15 combat deployments, 3 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star for valor under fire. None of that was visible from the outside. What Officer Hawkins saw was simply an aging black man in an unremarkable car. As Marcus pulled up to the checkpoint, he noticed something change in the guard's demeanor. Officer Hawkins, a white man in his mid-30s with a military haircut and a perpetual frown, straightened up. His face hardened. His hand shifted subtly closer to his weapon. "ID," Hawkins barked, not using the customary "good morning" he'd offered to the previous vehicles. Marcus extended his military ID, the special one issued to him as the incoming Provost Marshal, and smiled politely. "Good morning, officer. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Hawkins didn't take the ID, he didn't even look at it. Instead, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the interior of Marcus's car, lingering on the walking cane. "Purpose of your visit?" Hawkins demanded, his tone suggesting Marcus was an unwelcome intruder rather than authorized personnel. "I work here," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm reporting for duty." Hawkins scoffed, making no effort to hide his disbelief. "This gate is for official personnel only. Do you understand that, sir?" The last word dripped with sarcasm. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though the disrespect stung. He'd faced this before, the assumption that his presence was somehow suspicious or unwarranted, but not here, not at the base that had been his professional home for over a decade. "I understand completely," Marcus said. "That's why I'm presenting my ID. If you just check it, you'll see I'm authorized." Behind him, other cars were beginning to stack up. A few drivers were watching the interaction with growing interest. Officer Hawkins noticed the audience and seemed to stand taller, as if performing. "Step out of the vehicle," Hawkins ordered abruptly. Marcus blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Step out of the vehicle now." This was an escalation with no justification. Marcus had presented valid ID. He'd answered questions calmly. There was no security concern, no reason to doubt his legitimacy. except it seemed for the color of his skin. "Officer Hawkins," Marcus said, reading the man's nameplate. "I've presented my ID. I'm authorized to enter the base. There's no reason for me to exit my vehicle." Hawkins' face flushed with anger. "You refusing a direct order from security personnel?" By now, several more cars had pulled up behind Marcus. Windows were rolling down. Phone cameras were emerging. This was becoming a scene, exactly what Marcus had hoped to avoid on his first day. "I'm not refusing anything reasonable," Marcus replied, his voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. "I'm simply asking you to check my ID, which is standard procedure." Hawkins leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Marcus's ears. "You don't belong here. This gate isn't for your kind." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his 30 years of military service, he'd encountered racism, but rarely so blatant, so unapologetic, and never from someone whose job was to protect and serve the base community. "Officer Hawkins," Marcus said quietly, "I'd like to speak with your supervisor." Hawkins smirked, confident in his power. "I am the supervisor on duty, and I'm ordering you to turn around and leave the base immediately before I have you detained." Marcus took a deep breath. He'd hoped to arrive at his new position without fanfare, to ease into his role with humility and professionalism. But Officer Hawkins had forced his hand. "In that case," Marcus said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket, "I need you to look at this." He pulled out a second identification card, this one bearing the insignia of the Provost Marshal's office. Hawkins' eyes flickered to it involuntarily, then widened as comprehension dawned. "My name is Marcus Washington," he said clearly, loud enough now that nearby drivers could hear. "I'm the new base Provost Marshal, effectively the chief of police for this installation. And you, Officer Hawkins, have just created a very serious problem for yourself." The color drained from Hawkins' face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "Now," Marcus continued, his tone shifting from patient to commanding, "you will step back, radio your command center, and verify my identity. That's standard procedure, which you should have followed from the beginning." Hawkins stepped back as if physically pushed, fumbling for his radio. His hands trembled as he made the call, his eyes never leaving Marcus's unwavering gaze. The response came swiftly. Through the radio, clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Confirmed. That's the new PM. Let him through immediately." Hawkins lowered his radio slowly, his face a mask of dawning horror. "Welcome to Fort Bennett, sir," he managed, his voice barely audible. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Marcus didn't move. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Officer Hawkins. This was a deliberate abuse of authority. We'll discuss it further in my office, where I expect you to report immediately after your shift ends." With that, Marcus rolled up his window and drove through the gate, leaving Officer Hawkins standing rigid, watched by a growing crowd of witnesses who had just seen his true character exposed in the harsh light of day. What happened next would send shockwaves through the entire base security force and spark a reckoning that was long overdue. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their authority only to discover they picked the wrong target? Comment below with your experiences. And if you believe in standing up against discrimination, hit that like button to help more people see this important story. Marcus Washington drove through the base with his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, his heart still pounding from the confrontation. He hadn't wanted to pull rank. He hadn't wanted his first interaction with base security personnel to be adversarial, but Officer Hawkins had left him no choice. As he navigated toward the headquarters building, memories flooded back, not just from today, but from a lifetime of similar encounters. The store security guards who followed him through aisles, the police officers who pulled him over for routine checks, the restaurant hosts who claimed there were no tables available despite visible empty seats. He'd served his country for 3 decades, risen through the ranks through dedication and excellence, and still, there were people like Hawkins who looked at his skin and decided he didn't belong. Marcus pulled into the parking space marked Provost Marshal and sat for a moment, collecting himself. Today was supposed to be about new beginnings. He wouldn't let Hawkins taint that. The headquarters building was buzzing with activity when Marcus entered. Personnel saluted as he passed, many offering warm welcomes. His reputation had preceded him, a decorated combat veteran with an exemplary record in military law enforcement. He'd been specifically recruited for this position after the previous Provost Marshal retired under a cloud of controversy. Colonel Rebecca Jensen, the base commander, was waiting in his new office. She was a tall woman with short blonde hair and the direct gaze of someone who preferred honesty to platitudes. "Marcus," she said, extending her hand, "welcome to Fort Bennet. I've been looking forward to having you on the team." Marcus shook her hand firmly. "Thank you, Colonel. I'm honored to be here." She gestured for him to take a seat behind his new desk, a solid oak piece that had seen generations of leadership come and go. "How was your first experience with our base? Everything go smoothly?" Marcus hesitated. He hadn't planned to bring up the incident right away, but he also wouldn't lie to his commanding officer. "Actually, no," he said carefully. "There was an issue at the main gate with one of your security personnel, an Officer Hawkins." Colonel Jensen's expression darkened immediately. "James Hawkins? What happened?" Marcus recounted the incident in detail, keeping his tone professional despite the lingering sting of humiliation. He watched as Jensen's face shifted from concern to outright anger. "This isn't the first complaint about Hawkins," she said when he'd finished, "but it's certainly the most egregious." "Previous complaints?" Marcus asked, his law enforcement instincts kicking in. Jensen nodded grimly. "Mostly from civilian personnel of color, some from lower-ranking military members. Allegations of disparate treatment, unnecessary searches, disrespectful language. Nothing blatant enough to trigger formal disciplinary action, especially given his connections in the department." "Connections?" "His uncle was the Deputy Provost Marshal under my predecessor. Retired now, but his influence lingers." Jensen leaned forward. "That's part of why we brought you in, Marcus. The security force here needs a cultural reset. I just didn't expect you'd experience it firsthand on your first day." Marcus nodded slowly, processing this information. So Hawkins' behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, one apparently known to command, but never properly addressed. "I've directed him to report to my office after his shift," Marcus said. "Good," Jensen replied. "I'd like to be present for that conversation if you don't mind. This kind of behavior reflects on my entire command, and I want him to understand that." Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock at the door. A young sergeant entered, looking nervous. "Sir, ma'am," she said, "I think you should see this." She placed a tablet on the desk. On the screen was a social media post that was rapidly gaining traction. Someone had filmed the entire confrontation at the gate. The video, shot from a car 2 vehicles behind Marcus, clearly captured Hawkins's dismissive attitude, his refusal to check Marcus's ID, and his visible shock when he realized who Marcus was. The caption read, "Racist gate guard at Fort Bennet tries to deny entry to the new Black Provost Marshal. Justice served in real time. Military racism, genre accountability." The video had already accumulated thousands of views and shares in the hours since the incident. Jensen looked up from the tablet, her expression grim. "This changes things. It's no longer just an internal matter." Marcus nodded. The public dimension complicated everything. On one hand, it created pressure for meaningful action rather than the kind of quiet handling that had obviously failed in the past. On the other, it risked turning a personnel issue into a media circus. "How do you want to handle this?" Jensen asked, deferring to his expertise in law enforcement matters. Marcus thought carefully before responding. "Transparently," he finally said, "we conduct a thorough investigation, not just into this incident, but into all previous complaints. We review Hawkins's entire record, and we make decisions based on facts, not connections or convenience." Jensen smiled slightly. "That's exactly why I wanted you for this job, Washington." She stood. "I'll let you get settled in. Hawkins ends his shift at 1400. We'll reconvene then." After she left, Marcus sat alone in his new office, contemplating the challenges ahead. He hadn't expected his first test as Provost Marshal to come so quickly or to be so personal, but perhaps it was fitting. How he handled this situation would set the tone for his entire tenure. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. "Samantha, it's Marcus. I need you to pull all complaint records for an Officer James Hawkins going back 5 years, and I need them before 1400 today." As he hung up, Marcus stared at the tablet, still displaying the viral video. The comments section was filling with stories. Other people, mostly minorities, describing similar experiences at Fort Bennet and other military installations. What had happened to him wasn't unique, but his position gave him the power to address it, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. For the first time since the confrontation, Marcus felt a sense of purpose overtaking his anger. Officer Hawkins had picked the wrong person to discriminate against today, not because Marcus was the Provost Marshal, but because he was someone who wouldn't let injustice stand, no matter who it happened to. The meeting with Officer Hawkins was set for 1400 hours precisely, but by 1330, Marcus's office was already a hub of focused activity. Samantha Davis, his chief investigator and a woman renowned for her thoroughness, had delivered a thick folder containing Hawkins' complete service record, along with every complaint ever filed against him, many more than Colonel Jensen had initially suggested. Marcus reviewed the documents with growing concern. The pattern was unmistakable. Over his 8-year career at Fort Bennet, Hawkins had accumulated 27 formal complaints, and likely many more informal ones that never made it into the system. The vast majority came from people of color, and all had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence or conflicting accounts. Even more troubling were the performance reviews. Despite the complaints, Hawkins had received consistently positive evaluations from his supervisors, including specific praise for his thoroughness in security screening and his attention to detail in identifying suspicious individuals. Colonel Jensen arrived at 1345, her face grim as she scanned the documents Marcus had arranged on his desk. "This is worse than I realized," she admitted. "I knew there were issues, but seeing it all laid out like this—" "The problem goes beyond Hawkins," Marcus said quietly. "The system protected him, encouraged him even." Jensen nodded, accepting her share of responsibility as the base commander. "So what's our approach here?" "Direct confrontation with the evidence," Marcus replied. "No room for denial or deflection." At precisely 1400 hours, there was a knock at the door. Sergeant Lopez, Marcus's new administrative assistant, opened it to reveal Officer James Hawkins standing stiffly in his uniform, his face carefully composed, though his eyes darted nervously around the room. "Officer Hawkins reporting as ordered, sir," he said, his voice betraying none of the arrogance he'd displayed at the gate. "Enter and stand at attention," Marcus instructed, his tone professional but cool. Hawkins complied, moving to stand directly in front of Marcus's desk. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Colonel Jensen, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Officer Hawkins," Marcus began, "do you understand why you've been called here today?" "Yes, sir," Hawkins replied promptly. "To discuss the misunderstanding at the main gate this morning." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Misunderstanding, is that how you characterize what happened?" "Sir, I was simply following security protocols. When faced with an unfamiliar individual attempting to access the base, I exercised appropriate caution." Marcus let the words hang in the air for a moment, then reached for a remote control on his desk. The large screen on the wall behind him flickered to life, displaying the social media video of their encounter. Hawkins visibly flinched as his own voice filled the room. "You don't belong here. This gate isn't for your kind." Marcus paused the video. "That doesn't sound like security protocol to me, Officer Hawkins. That sounds like prejudice." Hawkins swallowed hard. "Sir, my words were taken out of context. I was referring to civilian visitors, not—" "I was in civilian clothes, but I presented military ID," Marcus interrupted, "and you refused to even look at it. Why is that?" Hawkins faltered. "I was being thorough." Marcus opened the folder on his desk. "Let's talk about your version of thorough, Officer Hawkins." He pulled out a stack of complaint forms. 27 formal complaints in 8 years, 85% from people of color, all dismissed. Hawkins' face paled slightly, but he maintained his rigid posture. Complaints don't equal wrongdoing, sir. Anyone can file a complaint. True, Marcus acknowledged, but patterns matter, and your pattern is disturbingly consistent. Colonel Jensen spoke up for the first time. What troubles me most, Officer Hawkins, is that these complaints were never properly investigated. They were dismissed with minimal review, often by your direct supervisor, who happens to be your uncle's former subordinate. Hawkins' eyes narrowed slightly. Are you suggesting preferential treatment, ma'am? I'm not suggesting it, Jensen replied coldly. I'm stating it as fact. The evidence is overwhelming. Marcus stood up, walking around the desk to face Hawkins directly. Despite the officer's height advantage, Marcus's presence filled the room. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. You are suspended from duty, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into your conduct. Your gate access privileges are revoked, your weapon will be secured, and you will report to the administrative office daily at 0800 for assignment to non-security duties until this matter is resolved. Hawkins' composure finally cracked. Sir, this is an overreaction to a single incident. This is not about a single incident, Marcus cut in. This is about a pattern of behavior that has been allowed to continue unchecked for years. Behavior that undermines the trust and safety of every person on this base. And reflects poorly on this entire installation, Colonel Jensen added. The video of your conduct this morning has already been viewed over 50,000 times. It has brought shame to Fort Bennett and to the uniform you wear. Hawkins looked between them, realization dawning that his usual protections weren't going to save him this time. I have the right to union representation, he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. Yes, you do, Marcus agreed. And you'll need it. Because if this investigation confirms what I already suspect, you won't just be losing your position, you'll be facing serious disciplinary action. This isn't fair, Hawkins protested, his voice rising. You're singling me out because of one mistake. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a quiet intensity that was more powerful than any shout. Officer Hawkins, what isn't fair is a system that has allowed you to mistreat people based on their appearance for years. What isn't fair is that dozens of complaints were ignored because you had connections. What isn't fair is that you looked at a 30-year veteran of this country's military and decided, based solely on his skin color, that he didn't belong. Hawkins had no response. His face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Sergeant Lopez will escort you to Human Resources to process your suspension, Marcus continued. Your security credentials and weapon will be surrendered immediately. Yes, sir, Hawkins managed, his voice tight. As Lopez led Hawkins from the office, Colonel Jensen turned to Marcus. That was just the beginning, wasn't it? Marcus nodded gravely. The beginning of a much larger reckoning. Hawkins is a symptom, not the disease. Jensen sighed heavily. I brought you here to clean house, Marcus. I just didn't realize how dirty it really was. With respect, Colonel, Marcus replied. I think you did. That's exactly why I'm here. As the door closed behind them, Marcus returned to his desk, already mapping out the broader investigation in his mind. Hawkins had picked the wrong person to discriminate against today, not just because Marcus had the authority to hold him accountable, but because he had the will to address the underlying system that had enabled him for so long. The real work was just beginning. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone in power was finally held accountable for their actions? Comment below and share your story. And if you believe in the importance of addressing systemic discrimination, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories of justice and accountability. The news of Officer Hawkins's suspension spread through Fort Bennett like wildfire. By the end of the day, Marcus's office had received dozens of calls, some from people eager to share their own experiences with Hawkins, others from security personnel worried about a witch hunt. Marcus listened to them all. Each call, each story, added another piece to the puzzle he was assembling. A comprehensive picture of not just one officer's misconduct, but an entire system's failure. Sergeant Darius Williams, a young black MP who had transferred to Fort Bennet 6 months earlier, sat across from Marcus, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. It had taken considerable courage for him to come forward, and the tension in his shoulders showed it. "I noticed it my first week here, sir," Williams explained. "The way Hawkins and some of the others would single out certain cars at the gate. The comments they'd make when they thought no one important was listening." "Did you report it?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer. Williams looked down. "Once, to Lieutenant Parker. He said I should focus on fitting in instead of stirring up trouble. After that," he shrugged helplessly. Marcus nodded, making a note. Lieutenant Parker, another name that kept appearing in his investigation. "What about the other officers? Were they all like Hawkins?" "No, sir," Williams said firmly. "Most of them are good people trying to do their jobs right. But there's a core group, Hawkins, Mercer, Delgado, and a few others, who set the tone, and nobody wants to cross them." "Because of their connections?" Williams nodded. "Yes, sir, and because they make life hell for anyone who speaks up." By the end of the week, Marcus had conducted 17 similar interviews and reviewed over 100 historical complaints. The pattern was clearer than ever. A small but influential group within base security had created a culture of discrimination, protected by a network of relationships that reached surprisingly high in the chain of command. Colonel Jensen sat across from him on Friday afternoon, reviewing his preliminary findings with growing dismay. 6 officers involved in systematic discrimination, she said, reading from his report. 3 supervisors who actively covered it up, and potential links to the former Deputy Provost Marshal himself. She looked up, her expression grim. "This goes deeper than I anticipated." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus agreed. "And it's not just affecting civilians or visitors. It's poisoning morale among our own personnel, especially minorities." Jensen set the report down, her decision already made. "What do you need from me, Marcus?" "Your full support for a complete overhaul of the security force. New training protocols, new supervision structures, and immediate action against the officers most clearly involved in misconduct." "You have it," she said without hesitation. "But be prepared for pushback. These people have friends both on and off base." Marcus smiled thinly. "I'm counting on it, Colonel. The louder they protest, the more they expose themselves." The following Monday, Marcus called an all-hands meeting for the entire security force. The base auditorium was filled to capacity. 116 security personnel, ranging from entry-level guards to senior supervisors. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus took the stage, flanked by Colonel Jensen and Samantha Davis. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying easily through the space. "For those I haven't had the chance to meet personally, I'm Provost Marshal Marcus Washington. I've been on the job for exactly 1 week." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, some curious, some hostile, many carefully neutral. "In that week, I've learned a great deal about how security operations have been conducted at Fort Bennet. Some of what I've learned has been impressive. Much of it has been deeply troubling." A murmur ran through the crowd. Marcus held up a hand for silence. "Let me be clear about something. The vast majority of you are dedicated professionals who serve this base with honor and integrity. You are not the problem. But you have been working within a system that is fundamentally broken and that stops today." He clicked a remote, bringing up a PowerPoint slide that outlined the investigation's key findings, without naming specific officers. Over the past 5 years, there have been 143 formal complaints of discriminatory treatment by security personnel. 89% were dismissed without proper investigation. 72% were filed by people of color. The room was utterly silent now, all eyes fixed on the damning statistics. "This isn't about a few bad apples," Marcus continued. "This is about a culture that has tolerated and even rewarded behavior that goes against everything we stand for as a military community." In the third row, Officer Mercer, one of Hawkins's closest allies, stood up abruptly. "With all due respect, sir, We have protocols to follow. If certain demographics trigger more security concerns, that's not discrimination. That's doing our job." Several heads nodded in agreement. Marcus had expected this pushback. "Officer Mercer, isn't it?" he said calmly. "I understand your perspective, but let me ask you this. When a black colonel pulls up to your gate, is he statistically more likely to be a security threat than a white private?" Mercer hesitated. "No, sir, but—" "And yet," Marcus continued, "black officers are 3 times more likely to be subjected to additional screening at Fort Bennet gates than their white counterparts. How do you explain that discrepancy?" Mercer had no answer. He sat down slowly, his face flushed. "This isn't about ignoring legitimate security concerns," Marcus assured the room. "It's about ensuring that our security measures are applied fairly and consistently, based on behavior and facts, not on appearance or personal bias." He clicked to the next slide, which outlined the changes that would be implemented immediately. Mandatory retraining for all security personnel on unbiased screening procedures. Body cameras for all gate guards and patrol officers. A new oversight committee including civilian representatives. Anonymous reporting system for both personnel and base visitors. Regular data analysis of security stops by demographic factors. "These changes aren't punitive," Marcus emphasized. "They're corrective. They will make you better at your jobs, and they will restore trust in the vital work you do." He paused, his expression hardening slightly. "That said, there will be accountability for those who have abused their positions. As of this morning, 6 officers have been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Their names will not be announced publicly at this time, but they have been notified individually." A tense silence followed this announcement. Everyone in the room was mentally checking which of their colleagues were absent today. "I understand that change is difficult," Marcus acknowledged. "Some of you may resist it. Some may even resent it. But let me be absolutely clear. This is happening. How you respond to it will determine your future at Fort Bennet." He stepped away from the podium, signaling that the formal portion of the meeting was over. "Colonel Jensen and I will now take questions. Please be direct and respectful." The questions came quickly, some hostile, many genuinely concerned about how the changes would affect day-to-day operations. Marcus answered each one with patience and clarity, never becoming defensive even when challenged directly. After nearly an hour, a young female officer raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, may I ask a personal question?" Marcus nodded. "Go ahead. The incident at the gate last week with Officer Hawkins, how did that make you feel? As a person, not as the Provost Marshal." The room fell silent. It was the question no one else had dared to ask, cutting through protocols and politics to the human core of the matter. Marcus considered it carefully. His instinct was to deflect, to maintain professional distance. But something told him this moment called for honesty. "It made me feel exactly what it was designed to make me feel," he said quietly. "Small, unwelcome, unworthy. Despite 30 years of service to this country, 3 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star, in that moment I was reduced to nothing but my skin color." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many officers as possible. "And that's why this matters so much. Because no one, absolutely no one who has legitimate business on this base should ever be made to feel that way. Not a 4-star general, not a newly enlisted private, not a civilian contractor, no one." The young officer nodded, visibly moved by his answer. "Thank you for your honesty, sir." As the meeting broke up, Marcus noticed something unexpected. Officers were approaching him, not to complain about the changes, but to quietly express support. Some shared their own experiences of witnessing discrimination but feeling powerless to address it. Others simply thanked him for taking a stand. One older security officer, a white man with over 20 years on the job, waited until most others had left before approaching. "Marshal Washington," he said, extending his hand. "I just wanted to say, it's about damn time. This has been a long time coming." Marcus shook the man's hand firmly. "Better late than never, Chief Bryson." "Some of us tried to fight it," Bryson continued, his voice lowered. But the system was stacked against us. You might want to check the records of officers who transferred out over the past few years. You'll find some patterns there, too. Marcus nodded, making a mental note. I appreciate the tip. As Bryson walked away, Colonel Jensen approached. Well, that went better than I expected. It's just the beginning, Marcus reminded her. The real test will come when we start implementing these changes. Jensen smiled grimly. True. But you've already done something important here today. What's that? You've given good people permission to be good again. She glanced around the emptying auditorium. Don't underestimate how powerful that is. As they walked out together, Marcus reflected on the journey ahead. The confrontation at the gate had been painful and humiliating, but perhaps it had been necessary, a catalyst for the changes this community desperately needed. Officer Hawkins had tried to deny him entry to Fort Bennet that day. Instead, he had inadvertently opened the door to transformation. The investigation into the security force at Fort Bennet proceeded methodically over the next 3 weeks. Marcus Washington, true to his nature, was thorough, fair, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to the facts. The 6 officers placed on administrative leave, Hawkins, Mercer, Delgado, Jenkins, Torres, and Phillips, had their complete records scrutinized. Each complaint against them was reopened and properly investigated. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Data was analyzed. Patterns were documented. What emerged was a damning picture not just of individual misconduct, but of a coordinated effort to maintain what they called traditional standards at Fort Bennet, a euphemism for systematic discrimination against minorities, particularly black service members and visitors. Officer Hawkins, as suspected, was at the center of it all. His uncle, the former Deputy Provost Marshal, had positioned him as an unofficial enforcer of these standards. The evidence suggested he had been rewarded for targeting certain demographics, with performance reviews praising his instinct for identifying suspicious individuals. The case against all 6 officers was solid, but the most damning evidence came unexpectedly, from their own words. 2 days before the disciplinary hearing, Samantha Davis knocked on Marcus's door, a tablet in her hand and an expression of grim satisfaction on her face. Sir, you need to see this, she said, placing the tablet in front of him. One of our IT specialists found it while reviewing backup server data. On the screen was a private chat group called Gate Guardians. The members were the 6 suspended officers and 4 others who hadn't been initially implicated. The content was shocking: racist memes, celebratory messages about turning away undesirables, and explicit instructions on how to target certain types of visitors without triggering formal complaints. One exchange between Hawkins and Mercer, dated just days before Marcus's arrival, made his blood run cold. Hawkins: heard the new PM is some black guy from 3rd Division. Mercer: great, another diversity hire. Hawkins: don't worry, we'll show him how things really work around here. Marcus looked up at Davis, his expression unreadable. Have you shown this to Colonel Jensen? Not yet, sir. Wanted you to see it first. Marcus nodded. Good. Make copies, secure ones. Then show her immediately. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 0900 hours on a Tuesday morning. The base conference room had been transformed into an improvised courtroom. 6 tables were arranged for the accused officers, each with space for their union representatives. A longer table faced them, where Marcus, Colonel Jensen, and the Administrative Review Board would sit. Behind them all, rows of chairs had been set up for witnesses and observers. By 0830, the room was already tense with anticipation. The 6 officers sat stiffly in their designated places, their expressions ranging from defiant to nervous. Officer Hawkins kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Beside him, his union representative shuffled through papers with growing concern. He had just been shown the chat logs that morning. At precisely 0900, Marcus entered, followed by Colonel Jensen and the 3 senior officers who made up the review board. The room rose as they took their seats. Be seated, Marcus said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. This administrative hearing is now in session. He looked directly at the 6 officers, his gaze unwavering. You have each been provided with the evidence against you. You have each had the opportunity to consult with representation. Today, you will have the chance to respond to the charges before this board makes its final determination. Hawkins leaned over to whisper something to his representative, who shook his head firmly. Before we begin, Marcus continued, I want to be absolutely clear about something. This hearing is not about a single incident at the gate. It is about a pattern of behavior that has persisted for years. It is about the systematic mistreatment of personnel and visitors based on their race. And it is about the deliberate undermining of the security and integrity of this installation. He gestured to Samantha Davis, who distributed copies of a thick document to each member of the review board. The investigative report before you contains testimonies from 53 individuals who experienced discriminatory treatment at the hands of these officers. It includes statistical analysis demonstrating racial disparities in security stops that cannot be explained by any legitimate security concern. And it includes communications between these officers explicitly planning and celebrating such discrimination. Marcus turned to face the 6 accused directly. Officer Hawkins, as the senior officer among those accused, you will speak first. Do you wish to make a statement regarding these charges? Hawkins stood slowly, his posture rigid. The confidence he had displayed at the gate was gone, replaced by a tightly controlled anger. Yes, sir, I do. He cleared his throat. I categorically deny engaging in racial discrimination. My actions have always been motivated by security concerns and adherence to protocol. The chat messages have been taken out of context, and the statistical disparities can be explained by other factors. He paused, his jaw tightening. Furthermore, I believe this entire proceeding is a retaliatory action stemming from a personal grudge due to our interaction at the gate. Marshal Washington has a conflict of interest that should disqualify him from overseeing this process. Murmurs ran through the room. Marcus remained impassive, allowing Hawkins to continue. My record speaks for itself. 15 commendations for vigilance. Not a single security breach on my watch. If some people felt uncomfortable with my thoroughness, that's unfortunate, but irrelevant to my job performance. When Hawkins finally sat down, Marcus nodded to Colonel Jensen, who leaned forward. Officer Hawkins, are you familiar with Army Regulation 690-12 regarding equal opportunity and treatment? Yes, ma'am. And would you agree that it explicitly prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, or disability? Yes, ma'am, but there is no but, Officer Hawkins, Jensen cut in sharply. It's a yes or no question. Hawkins fell silent, his face flushing. Marcus tapped a key on his laptop and a screen behind him lit up, displaying the chat log exchange about his arrival. Officer Hawkins, is this your message? He asked, highlighting the words. Heard the new PM is some black guy from 3rd Division. Yes, sir, Hawkins admitted reluctantly. And this response from Officer Mercer. Great. Another diversity hire. Did you correct this characterization of my appointment? No, sir. And finally, your reply. Don't worry. We'll show him how things really work around here. What exactly did you mean by that, Officer Hawkins? Hawkins hesitated, visibly struggling for an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further. It was just talk, sir. Locker room banter. Interesting, Marcus replied, his tone measured. Because it seems to me like a premeditated plan to undermine the authority of the incoming Provost Marshal based explicitly on his race. He clicked to the next slide, showing another exchange, this one between Hawkins and Officer Delgado. Delgado. Turned away another one today. Driving a nice car, too. Should have seen his face when I made him park and walk to visitor control. Hawkins. Did you give him the full treatment? Delgado. Oh yeah, ID check, vehicle search, the works. He kept saying he was a colonel's brother. Like I care. Officer Delgado, Marcus said, turning to the Hispanic officer who had been unusually quiet throughout the proceedings. Would you care to explain this exchange? Delgado looked down at the table, "It was wrong, sir. I can't justify it." His simple admission sent a ripple through the room. It was the first crack in the united front the accused officers had maintained. Hawkins shot Delgado a look of fury, but it was too late. The dam had broken. Over the next 3 hours, the evidence mounted inexorably. Chat logs, testimonies, statistical analyses, all pointing to the same conclusion. This hadn't been occasional lapses in judgment. It had been a deliberate, coordinated campaign of discrimination. By the time all 6 officers had spoken, some defiant to the end, others, like Delgado, offering remorseful admissions, the outcome was clear to everyone in the room. Marcus conferred briefly with Colonel Jensen and the review board before addressing the room again. "This board will now deliberate. We will reconvene at 1500 hours to deliver our decision." As the room cleared, Sergeant Williams, the young MP who had been one of the first to come forward, approached Marcus quietly. "Sir, whatever happens, thank you. For the first time since I got here, I feel like something might actually change." Marcus nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but knowing that the real test was still to come. Fort Bennet wouldn't transform overnight. Decades of entrenched behavior and attitudes wouldn't disappear with the removal of 6 officers, no matter how influential they had been. But it was a start. At 1500 hours sharp, the room was filled again. The tension was palpable as Marcus and the review board took their seats. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented," Marcus began, his voice solemn, "this board has reached a unanimous decision." He looked directly at each of the accused officers as he continued. "Officers Hawkins, Mercer, Jenkins, and Phillips, you are hereby terminated from your positions, effective immediately. Your actions represent gross violations of military regulations, base security protocols, and basic ethical standards. You will surrender your credentials before leaving this room." Hawkins slumped in his seat, the reality of his situation finally hitting him. The other 3 remained stone-faced, though Phillips's hands trembled slightly on the table. "Officers Delgado and Torres," Marcus continued, "in consideration of your cooperation with this investigation and expressions of genuine remorse, you are suspended without pay for 60 days. Upon your return, you will be reassigned to non-security roles and required to complete extensive retraining. Any future violation, however minor, will result in immediate termination." Delgado nodded, visibly relieved. Torres closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. "Additionally," Marcus said, "the findings of this investigation will be referred to the Inspector General's office for potential criminal charges related to civil rights violations. Whether those charges are pursued is beyond the scope of this hearing." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. "Finally, this board recommends a comprehensive review of all security personnel at Fort Bennet, with particular attention to those who worked closely with the terminated officers or were part of the Gate Guardians chat group." Marcus surveyed the room, taking in the mix of reactions: relief from those who had suffered under the discriminatory regime, shock from those who had benefited from it, and uncertainty from everyone about what would come next. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, his voice taking on a new intensity. "What happened here was not just a failure of individual officers. It was a failure of leadership, including past leaders in my own office. It was a failure of oversight. It was a failure of courage from those who saw what was happening but said nothing." He stood, straightening to his full height. "That era ends today. Fort Bennet will be a place where every person, regardless of rank, race, gender, or background, is treated with dignity and respect. Those who cannot or will not uphold that standard have no place in our security force or on this base." As the hearing adjourned, the 6 officers were led out, 4 to process their termination, 2 to begin their suspension. The room slowly emptied, conversations buzzing about what had just transpired. Colonel Jensen remained behind, watching as Marcus gathered his notes. "That was well handled," she said quietly, "but you know this isn't over." Marcus nodded. "The blowback will start tomorrow, if not sooner. Hawkins' uncle still has friends in high places." "Let them come," Jensen replied with surprising fierceness. We did the right thing. I'll stand by that decision all the way to the Pentagon if necessary. Thank you, Colonel, Marcus said, genuinely appreciative of her support. But I want to be clear. Whatever heat comes from this, I'll take it. This was my investigation, my recommendation. Jensen shook her head. We're in this together, Marcus. That's what real leadership looks like. As they walked out of the conference room, Marcus felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and determination. The confrontation at the gate seemed both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. So much had changed in just a few weeks, and yet the real work was only beginning. Reforming a system was harder than removing a few bad actors. Building a culture of genuine respect and equality would take time, persistence, and constant vigilance. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as he stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, Marcus Washington knew one thing with absolute certainty. Officer Hawkins had picked the wrong person to discriminate against that day. Not because Marcus was the Provost Marshal, but because he was someone who understood that real change doesn't come from positions or titles. It comes from people who refuse to accept injustice, no matter the cost. People willing to stand up not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been told in words or actions, "You don't belong here. This place isn't for your kind." Fort Bennet was about to become a very different kind of place, and it all started because one man with a cane was denied entry to a place he had every right to be. Have you ever witnessed a system change because someone finally stood up and said, "Enough"? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of accountability to create real change, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. The fallout from the disciplinary hearing was swift and far-reaching. By the next morning, news of the terminations had spread throughout Fort Bennet and beyond. Regional media picked up the story, focusing initially on the viral video of Marcus's confrontation at the gate, then expanding to cover the broader investigation and its dramatic conclusion. For many in the Fort Bennet community, the news brought long-awaited relief. Staff Sergeant Jamila Robinson, who had avoided the main gate for years after repeated harassment, expressed what many felt. "It's like a weight has been lifted. For the first time, I feel like I truly belong here." But as Marcus had anticipated, not everyone welcomed the changes. The day after the hearing, he arrived at his office to find 3 voice messages waiting, all from retired Colonel Frank Hawkins, James Hawkins' uncle, and the former Deputy Provost Marshal. "Washington," the first message began, the speaker not bothering with formalities, "you've made a serious mistake. My nephew was one of the finest security officers on that base. This witch hunt won't stand." The second and third messages escalated in tone, with veiled threats about connections at the Pentagon and careers being destroyed. Marcus listened to each one carefully, then saved them as evidence. He had expected this response, the old guard protecting its own. What he hadn't expected was the call that came mid-morning from General Howard Michaels, the regional commander overseeing 5 military installations, including Fort Bennet. "Marshal Washington," his assistant said. "General Michaels is on line 1. He says it's urgent." Marcus picked up the phone, bracing himself. "Marshal Washington speaking?" "Washington." The general's voice was clipped, authoritative. "I'm looking at a report about mass terminations in your security force. Want to tell me why I'm hearing about this from angry calls to my office rather than through proper channels?" "Sir, the full report was submitted through proper channels yesterday afternoon," Marcus replied calmly. "The investigation followed all protocols, and Colonel Jensen approved the findings before any action was taken." "Jensen," Michaels repeated as if the name explained everything. "She's always been a bit progressive for my taste." Marcus chose his next words carefully. "Sir, this wasn't about politics. It was about enforcing existing regulations and ensuring the security and integrity of Fort Bennet. 4 officers terminated at once is extreme, Washington. It looks like an overreaction, possibly a personal vendetta after that incident at the gate." And there it was, exactly the narrative Frank Hawkins would have pushed. Marcus took a deep breath before responding. General, I understand your concern, but I would respectfully suggest you review the complete evidence before reaching that conclusion. The chat logs alone provide irrefutable proof of systematic discrimination and security compromises. Chat logs? Yes, sir. A private group where these officers explicitly discuss targeting individuals based on race, circumventing protocols, and deliberately undermining base security to advance their personal biases. There was a long pause on the line. You have copies of these logs, I assume? Michaels finally asked, his tone slightly less confrontational. Yes, sir, along with statistical analyses, witness testimonies, and complete documentation of the investigation process. I'd be happy to brief you personally if you'd like. Another pause. That won't be necessary at this time. Send the full package to my office today. I'll review it myself. Yes, sir, it will be there within the hour. After the call ended, Marcus sat back in his chair, considering the exchange. General Michaels hadn't been openly hostile, but his initial approach had been telling. Someone, almost certainly Frank Hawkins, had gotten to him quickly, presenting a version of events designed to undermine the investigation's legitimacy. The fact that Michaels was willing to review the evidence was a positive sign, but Marcus harbored no illusions. The system that had protected officers like James Hawkins extended far beyond Fort Bennett. The real battle was just beginning. Colonel Jensen appeared in his doorway, her expression concerned. I just got a call from General Michaels' office. They're requesting all our files on the investigation. I know, Marcus replied. He called me directly. I'm sending everything over now. This is going to get political, isn't it? She asked, closing the door behind her. It already has, Marcus acknowledged. Frank Hawkins is pulling strings, trying to frame this as a personal vendetta or an overreaction. Jensen shook her head in disgust. The man's been retired for years and he's still causing problems. People like that never really leave, Marcus said. They just operate from the shadows. Before Jensen could respond, Marcus's phone rang again. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. Sir, there's a Congressman DeWitt on line 2. He says it's regarding the recent personnel actions at Fort Bennett. Marcus and Jensen exchanged a look of surprise. Congressman Richard DeWitt represented the district that included Fort Bennett, but he rarely involved himself in base operations. Put him through, Marcus said. Marshal Washington? The congressman's voice was smooth, practiced. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Congressman. What can I do for you? I've been hearing some concerning reports about mass terminations at Fort Bennett. Several constituents, military families, have reached out to my office expressing alarm. Marcus nodded to himself. The political pressure was mounting faster than he'd anticipated. I appreciate their concern, Congressman, but I can assure you these actions were taken after a thorough investigation and with full adherence to military regulations. I'm sure they were, DeWitt replied, his tone suggesting otherwise. However, I'm concerned about the impact on base security and morale. 4 experienced officers terminated at once. That creates a significant gap in your security operations, doesn't it? We have contingency plans in place, Marcus assured him, and I would argue that officers who deliberately target individuals based on race represent a far greater security risk than temporary understaffing. DeWitt paused, clearly not expecting such a direct response. Well, that's certainly a perspective, but I've known some of these officers personally, particularly James Hawkins. His uncle served with distinction for decades. These are respected military families. Respectfully, Congressman, Marcus said, his patience wearing thin, family connections don't excuse misconduct, and the evidence against these officers is overwhelming. I'd be happy to brief you on it if you'd like. That won't be necessary, DeWitt said quickly. I'm not questioning your authority, Marshal. I'm simply expressing concern as a representative of this community. I understand, Marcus replied, and as someone responsible for the safety and security of this community, I can assure you that these actions were necessary and long overdue. After a few more minutes of diplomatic back and forth, the call ended. Jensen, who had remained silent throughout, raised an eyebrow. DeWitt's never shown interest in base operations before, she noted. Frank Hawkins must have major connections. Or maybe, Marcus suggested, this is bigger than just Hawkins. Maybe we've hit a nerve, exposed a system that a lot of powerful people have a vested interest in maintaining. The rest of the day brought more calls, more inquiries, more pressure. But for every call questioning the terminations, there were two expressing support. Base personnel, civilian employees, family members, people who had experienced or witnessed the discrimination firsthand and were finally seeing action taken. By evening, when Marcus finally left his office, he was exhausted but resolute. As he walked to his car, he spotted a familiar figure waiting near the parking lot. Sergeant Darius Williams, the young MP who had been one of the first to speak up about the discrimination he'd witnessed. "Evening, Marshal," Williams said, straightening as Marcus approached. "Got a minute?" "Of course, Sergeant. What's on your mind?" Williams hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "I heard about the calls, the pressure you're getting from upstairs. Some of the other MPs are worried this whole thing might get reversed, that Hawkins and the others might come back." Marcus understood the fear. For someone in Williams's position, speaking out had been a significant risk. If the terminated officers were reinstated, the consequences for those who had testified against them could be severe. "That's not going to happen, Sergeant," Marcus assured him firmly. "The evidence is solid. The decision was made according to protocol, and Colonel Jensen and I aren't backing down." Williams nodded, visibly relieved. "That means a lot, sir, to all of us. For the first time, it feels like maybe the system can actually work." As Williams walked away, Marcus reflected on his words. Maybe the system can actually work. That was what this was really about. Not just punishing a few discriminatory officers, but proving that the system itself could function as intended. That regulations against discrimination weren't just words on paper, but principles that would be enforced regardless of who violated them. Over the next few days, the pressure continued to mount. General Michaels called again, his tone more measured after reviewing the evidence, but still concerned about the optics of the situation. Congressman DeWitt made public statements about rushing to judgment and respecting due process. Frank Hawkins gave an interview to a local news station, portraying his nephew as a dedicated officer being sacrificed to political correctness. But Marcus held firm. He made himself available for questions, provided evidence when appropriate, and never once wavered in his conviction that the right action had been taken. 1 week after the disciplinary hearing, he received an unexpected visitor, a civilian woman in her early 60s, smartly dressed and carrying herself with quiet dignity. "Marshal Washington," his assistant announced. "This is Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She says it's a personal matter." Marcus stood to greet her, curious. The name wasn't familiar to him. "Mrs. Carter, please come in. How can I help you?" She took a seat across from his desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Marshal Washington, I'm James Hawkins' mother-in-law. I've come to apologize." Of all the things Marcus had expected, this wasn't even on the list. He managed to keep his surprise from showing on his face. "That's not necessary, Mrs. Carter. Your son-in-law's actions are his own responsibility." She shook her head firmly. "No, it is necessary. My daughter Michelle has been married to James for 12 years. I've seen how he treats people, especially people who look like you and me." She gestured to her own dark skin. "I should have spoken up long ago, but I kept quiet for my daughter's sake." Marcus listened, sensing there was more to her story. 2 years ago," she continued, "my nephew came to visit us. He's in the Army, stationed in Germany. James was off duty, but when he saw Darnell in our front yard, he immediately went into officer mode. Demanded ID, questioned why he was there, even though he was on our private property." She took a shaky breath. Michelle tried to explain that Darnell was family, but James wouldn't listen. Said he was suspicious. Made him sit on the curb while he called it in. My own nephew, a staff sergeant with 2 tours in Afghanistan, humiliated in front of our neighbors. Marcus felt a familiar anger rising but kept his expression neutral. "I'm sorry that happened to your family. After I saw that video of you at the gate," Mrs. Carter continued, "I knew exactly what had happened. It was Darnell all over again, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. I've been keeping a record, dates, times, comments James has made at family gatherings, things he's said about his work, people he's dealt with. I don't know if it's useful to you now, but I wanted you to have it. Marcus accepted the notebook, understanding its significance. This wasn't just evidence. It was a testimony, a personal reckoning with complicity. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. This took courage. She stood to leave, then paused. My daughter's filing for divorce. She says she can't be married to someone who treats people that way, who might someday treat our grandchildren that way if they take after my side of the family. After Mrs. Carter left, Marcus sat alone in his office, the notebook open on his desk. It contained page after page of detailed entries, racist comments, boasts about discriminatory actions at work, explicit statements about keeping certain people out of Fort Bennet. It was further confirmation that the right decision had been made. But more than that, it was a reminder of the human cost of discrimination, how it poisoned not just professional environments but personal ones, how it tore families apart and forced impossible choices on people like Evelyn Carter. Later that day, Marcus made copies of the notebook and added them to the investigation file. When Congressman DeWitt called again to press for reconsideration of the terminations, Marcus was able to reference specific entries that corroborated the official findings. The political pressure gradually began to subside as more evidence became public. General Michaels, after a thorough review of the case, issued a statement supporting the disciplinary actions. Even Frank Hawkins eventually went quiet, perhaps realizing that further publicity would only bring more attention to his own role in enabling the discriminatory culture. 3 months after the confrontation at the gate, Fort Bennet had undergone a remarkable transformation. The security force, now led by officers who had previously been marginalized or silenced, operated with a new commitment to fairness and transparency. Body cameras had been implemented at all gates. Complaint procedures had been streamlined and made truly accessible. Regular audits ensured that security measures were applied consistently regardless of race or background. Most importantly, the culture had begun to shift. Personnel who had once avoided the main gate now used it freely. Visitors of all backgrounds were treated with the same professional courtesy. The fear and tension that had characterized interactions with security were replaced by mutual respect. On a crisp fall morning, Marcus stood at the main gate, observing the smooth flow of traffic and the professional conduct of the officers on duty. Beside him was Colonel Jensen, who had become not just an ally, but a friend during the challenging months of reform. "You know," she said, watching as a young black lieutenant was waved through with the same courteous efficiency as the white colonel ahead of him, "when I first contacted you about this position, I hoped you'd bring positive change. But I never imagined how quickly or how completely it would happen." Marcus smiled slightly. "It wasn't me, Colonel. It was all the people who had been waiting for permission to do the right thing. They just needed someone to go first." As they turned to leave, a car pulled up to the gate. The driver, an elderly black veteran with a cane visible in the passenger seat, presented his ID to the young officer on duty. "Welcome to Fort Bennet, sir," the officer said with genuine respect. "Thank you for your service." Marcus watched as the veteran, surprise and gratitude visible on his face, drove through the gate without being questioned, without being made to feel like an intruder in a place he had every right to be. That, more than any policy change or disciplinary action, was the real victory. That moment of simple human dignity, denied to so many for so long, finally restored. Officer Hawkins had picked the wrong person to discriminate against that day at the gate, but in doing so he had inadvertently set in motion changes that would ensure he was the last officer at Fort Bennet who could discriminate against anyone. It wasn't just about one man with a cane being treated with dignity. It was about every person who would come after him, people who would never know the difference because they would only experience Fort Bennet as it should have been all along. A place where everyone belonging there was treated like they belonged. If you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, hit that like button and subscribe. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone in authority being held accountable for discrimination? How did it change the environment? Your stories matter, and they remind us that change is always possible when brave people refuse to accept injustice. The story of Marcus Washington and Fort Bennet didn't end with the transformation of the base's security culture. It sparked a broader movement within military installations across the country. 6 months after the incident at the gate, the Department of Defense launched a comprehensive review of security protocols at all domestic bases, with a specific focus on potential racial disparities in access procedures. Marcus was invited to serve as a special advisor to the committee overseeing this review, a recognition of how his handling of the Fort Bennet situation had become a model for addressing systematic discrimination. During a briefing at the Pentagon, a senior official asked Marcus what he considered the most important lesson from his experience. "Documentation," Marcus replied without hesitation. The chat logs, the statistical analyses, Mrs. Carter's notebook, these weren't just evidence for the investigation. They were indisputable proof that made it impossible for anyone to dismiss what was happening as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. The committee took this lesson to heart, implementing new data collection requirements for security operations across all military installations. Gate encounters were now logged by demographic factors, creating transparency and accountability in a system that had previously operated in shadows. Back at Fort Bennet, the changes continued to take root and flourish. The new security team, led by officers who truly understood the importance of fair and respectful treatment, became known for their professionalism. What had once been a dreaded experience, especially for minorities, became a model of efficiency and courtesy. Sergeant Darius Williams, who had risked his career to speak up about the discrimination he witnessed, was promoted to lieutenant and put in charge of training new security personnel. His curriculum included not just technical aspects of base security, but extensive modules on implicit bias, equitable enforcement, and the critical importance of treating every person with dignity. The most effective security force, Williams often told his trainees, is one that earns the trust and respect of the community it serves. We can't do that if we're targeting people based on how they look. Even some of the officers who had been disciplined found paths to redemption. Officer Delgado, after serving his 60-day suspension, returned to a non-security role and became an outspoken advocate for the reforms. He spoke candidly about how he had been drawn into the discriminatory culture, how easy it had been to justify treating people differently when everyone around him was doing the same. "I'm not proud of what I did," he told a group of new recruits during an orientation session. "But I am proud of how Fort Bennet has changed, and I'm committed to being part of that change going forward." 1 year to the day after the confrontation at the gate, Marcus received a letter from an unexpected source, Michelle Carter, James Hawkins's ex-wife. She had finalized her divorce and moved to another state, but wanted to share something with the man who had inadvertently changed the course of her life. "When I saw that video of you at the gate," she wrote, "it was like seeing every ugly thing I'd been trying to ignore about my marriage." James didn't just treat strangers that way. He brought that same contempt home. I'd convinced myself it was just how men talk or part of the job. But watching him try to humiliate you made me realize I couldn't be part of it anymore. She went on to describe how the divorce had been difficult but liberating, how her mother, Evelyn, had supported her through it, how her nephew Darnell was now stationed at Fort Bennet and reported that it was like a different world from what James had described. "I don't know if you'll ever see this letter," she concluded, "but I wanted you to know that what you did didn't just change Fort Bennet. It changed lives. It gave people like me the courage to demand better, not just from institutions, but from the people in our lives." Marcus kept that letter in his desk drawer, a reminder that standing up to discrimination had ripple effects far beyond what we can see or measure, that sometimes the most important changes happen not in policy manuals or training programs, but in individual hearts and minds. As for James Hawkins himself, his story took a different turn. After his termination, he filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied based on the overwhelming evidence against him. He gave bitter interviews to anyone who would listen, portraying himself as a victim of political correctness gone mad. But as time passed and more details of his misconduct became public, even his most ardent supporters began to distance themselves. Eventually, Hawkins left the area, moving to a small town in another state. Marcus heard through military channels that he was working as a security guard at a shopping mall, a position that carried none of the authority or respect he had once wielded at Fort Bennet. Frank Hawkins, the uncle who had tried so hard to protect his nephew's career and the discriminatory system they had built together, faded into obscurity. His calls to the Pentagon went unreturned. His influence, once substantial, evaporated in the face of irrefutable evidence of misconduct. 2 years after that fateful morning at the gate, Marcus Washington stood in the same spot where Officer Hawkins had tried to deny him entry. The gate looked the same guardhouse, same signs, same flow of traffic. But everything else had changed. The officers on duty moved with confident professionalism, treating each person with the same respect, regardless of appearance. The atmosphere was alert but welcoming, secure without being intimidating. Personnel of all backgrounds passed through without fear or apprehension. Colonel Jensen joined him, now wearing the insignia of a brigadier general, a promotion she had received partly due to her leadership during the Fort Bennet reforms. "Admiring your handiwork?" she asked with a smile. Marcus shook his head. "Not mine, ours. All of us who refused to accept that discrimination was just how things worked around here." They watched as a car pulled up to the gate. The driver was an elderly black veteran, leaning heavily on his cane as he presented his ID. The security officer, a young white woman who had been hired after the reforms, checked it efficiently and waved him through with a respectful, "Thank you for your service, sir." It was a simple interaction, the kind that happened hundreds of times every day at bases across the country. But for Marcus, it represented everything he had fought for, the right of every person to be treated with dignity, to be judged by their credentials and character rather than their appearance, to belong in spaces where they had earned the right to be. "You know," General Jensen said thoughtfully, "when you first arrived, I told you we needed a cultural reset. I didn't realize how true that was, or how deeply the problems ran." "The hardest part wasn't identifying the problem," Marcus replied. "It was convincing people that change was possible, that the way things had always been wasn't the way they had to remain." As they walked back toward headquarters, Marcus reflected on the journey of the past 2 years. The confrontation at the gate had been painful, humiliating, infuriating. But it had also been necessary, a catalyst for changes that might otherwise have taken decades or never happened at all. Officer Hawkins had picked the wrong person to discriminate against that day, not because Marcus Washington was the Provost Marshal, but because he was someone who understood that real change doesn't come from avoiding difficult confrontations. It comes from facing them head-on, armed with truth, persistence, and the unwavering belief that justice is always worth fighting for. And in that fight, he had discovered something powerful, that one person refusing to accept discrimination could inspire others to do the same. That courage was contagious, that systems maintained through fear and silence could be dismantled when enough people found their voices. The Fort Bennet story eventually faded from the headlines. Other incidents, other challenges, other victories took its place in the public consciousness. But for those who lived and worked at the base, the transformation remained, not as a momentary triumph, but as a new normal. Security officers were now trained not just in threat detection and protocol enforcement, but in recognizing and countering their own biases. Complaint procedures were transparent and effective, Data was regularly reviewed to ensure equitable treatment. And most importantly, the culture had shifted from one that tolerated discrimination to one that actively rejected it. 3 years after the confrontation at the gate, Marcus Washington received a call from the Secretary of Defense. The military was launching a comprehensive initiative to address discrimination across all branches and installations, and they wanted him to lead it. It would mean leaving Fort Bennet, leaving the community he had helped transform, but it would also mean taking those lessons to a national scale. After careful consideration, Marcus accepted. His last day at Fort Bennet was marked by a simple ceremony, no grand speeches or elaborate farewells, just the quiet acknowledgement of work well done and changes that would endure long after his departure. As he drove toward the main gate for the final time as Provost Marshal, Marcus thought about that morning 3 years ago, how Officer Hawkins had looked at him and decided, based solely on his appearance, that he didn't belong. How that single act of discrimination had set in motion changes that would affect thousands of lives. He thought about Mrs. Carter, who had found the courage to speak up against her own son-in-law, about Sergeant Williams, now Lieutenant Williams, who had risked his career to tell the truth, about Elena Ruiz, the young clerk who had refused to participate in the cover-up, about all the people who had been waiting for permission to do the right thing, who just needed someone to go first. And he thought about all the people who would pass through that gate in the years to come, people who would never know about Officer Hawkins or the discriminatory system that had once existed, because they would only experience Fort Bennet as it should have been all along, a place where everyone belonging there was treated like they belonged. As Marcus approached the gate, he recognized the officer on duty, a young black woman who had been part of the first class of security personnel hired after the reforms. "Good morning, Marshal Washington," she said, her posture professional but relaxed. "Last day, isn't it?" "That's right, Officer Johnson," he replied with a small smile. "How are things at the gate?" She returned the smile. "Quiet, sir, just the way we like it." Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of her words. Quiet didn't mean inactive. The gate was as busy as ever. It meant free from the tension, fear, and discrimination that had once defined it. "Keep up the good work, officer," he said, driving through. "Yes, sir," she replied, "and thank you for everything." As Fort Bennet receded in his rearview mirror, Marcus felt a sense of completion. The work of creating truly equitable systems would never be finished. There would always be new challenges, new biases to confront, new barriers to break down. But he had proven something important at Fort Bennet. That change was possible, that discrimination could be confronted and overcome, that institutions could be transformed. Officer Hawkins had picked the wrong person to discriminate against that day at the gate, but in doing so, he had inadvertently created an opportunity for real, lasting change. Change that would affect not just one base or one security force, but potentially the entire military. And it had all started with a simple, powerful truth, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look or what others might assume about them. That belonging isn't about appearance, it's about right. And that sometimes standing up for that right can transform not just a moment but an entire system. If you believe in the power of standing up against discrimination, hit that like button and subscribe. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment when one person's courage inspired others to speak up? How did it change things? Your stories matter, and they remind us all that change is always possible, even in systems that seem unchangeable, when brave people refuse to accept injustice. Thank you for watching this incredible story of courage, accountability, and transformation. Remember, it's not just about who was wrong that day at the gate. It's about who was brave enough to make it right. What would you have done if you were in Master Sergeant Washington's position at the gate? Would you have immediately revealed your identity, or would you have handled it the way he did? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and accountability, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated on more powerful true stories that make a difference in our world. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's faced discrimination or someone who has the power to stop it, share this video with them. Sometimes all it takes is one story to change a perspective, and one perspective to change a system. Until next time, remember, courage isn't about never facing discrimination. It's about what you do when you face it. And sometimes the most powerful response isn't anger or retaliation. It's calm, methodical justice that changes the game for everyone. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.